she was under the bed the whole time. There are cases where the system fails to catch the right person, and then there are cases where every layer of evidence, surveillance, DNA, digital forensics, post-crime behavior, points in one direction so clearly that the more interesting question becomes not what happened, but how someone thought they could walk away from it.
Anna KEPNER. I suppose I wasn't expecting that this boy would be ordered into the custody of U.S. Marshals. It just all sounded very sudden and very abrupt, but maybe I should have known that was coming.
Yeah, for a while he was out there on pretrial release, even after he was indicted and he was going to be charged as an adult. And his defense lawyers successfully argue that he hasn't committed any new offenses on pretrial release. He's been out there under supervision for a long time now. He's not a threat to flee. He's not a threat against witnesses. He's not a threat to the community. He has no other offenses. So keep him out. And then the judge thought about it, let him go after the indictment. Remember, they let him walk and go home, and now said, now come back in. You're going into the Hooskow pending trial.
And I mean, wow, at 16, Marshall, so he was surrendered to the Marshals, which I suppose is a little less traumatic than them coming to your door and taking you out in your underwear. So he surrendered to the Marshals, and it was all very technical, the way the federal judge worded it. The Marshals are to take him to the federal courthouse, and then there's processing there, and then the Marshals are to take him to the Citrus County lockup. That's a county lockup, because I guess that's where they have facilities for kids. So let's start from that beginning process. The Marshals take him to the federal courthouse. Any idea sort of what that would look like? Whether the parents could be with them, whether they've got to walk away as soon as the Marshals have him in cuffs? Like, how do they do this?
Yeah, the Marshals are going to surround him. They're going to put him in handcuffs. They're going to walk him to the courthouse. The parents are not allowed to be next to him. They could trail behind, but they're going to be in charge of their kid now. And so once he gets to the courthouse, then you have that hearing, and then they decide where to go. They decide to send him to Citrus County. And they did that for a reason.
The federal prosecution of 16-year-old Timothy Hudson for the rape and murder of his 18-year-old stepsister, Anna KEPNER, aboard the Carnival Horizon is that second kind of case. A teenager, a shared cabin, a body found hidden under a bed, and a sequence of documented actions afterward that prosecutors are calling barbaric, intentional, and thoughtful. If that framing unsettles you as much as it should, like this video and subscribe. This channel is built for exactly this kind of forensic reckoning.
Ashley, first, because the federal government doesn't have its own standalone juvenile detention center. So they contract with local governments like Citrus County's detention facility, and it's also located near the family. Apparently, I think they live in the Tampa area, so Citrus County is outside of there.
So mom and dad and whoever else could be visiting on a regular basis, because that was part of the order too, that they were allowed. He was allowed regular visitation as well as a tablet, for communication that way. But when he's at the courthouse, now I get it. Like, courthouses have all sorts of little lockup spaces, right? That's where usually the defendant is locked up when they're on breaks and lunch and all the rest. But this kid is being brought by the Marshals to the courthouse, I guess for some kind of processing, and then whisked away to Citrus County, at which point he's just in with all the other juvies, or do they think of him as different because this is a sex crime? Like, I know that in grown-up jail, you got to be careful. You've got to have some sort of protective custody for those kinds of accusations. What about in juvie?
Right. Well, there's a federal law that says you can't put him in with adult criminals. So because he's underage, he's going to be kept separate from the adults. But he will be in an adult facility, but there's a juvenile wing for situations like this inside there.
Do they have other laws about PC, protective custody, and how long they can be isolated by themselves? I mean, I get it for adults. They go into protective custody all the time, but this is a kid. He's 16. He's probably crying his eyes out tonight. I'm just sort of wondering what the protocols are for dealing with kids like that when they've got to go to a grown-up facility, even in a juvie wing.
So let me ask you something before we go any further. At what point does post-crime behavior stop being shock and start being proof of premeditation? Anna KEPNER was 18, a Florida cheerleader, by every account the kind of person whose presence filled a room. Timothy Hudson was 16, her stepbrother. They shared that cabin with Anna's 13-year-old brother. What the mainstream coverage largely skips over is the relational architecture here, a blended family dynamic aboard a confined vessel in international waters where there were no exits, no neighbors to call, and no way to simply leave.
Are the defense attorneys allowed to bring up the fact that he's not an adult?
Well, it's impossible to ignore it. First of all, we've seen this over and over again. And remember the Nicholas Cruz case? I can't believe you mentioned his name. Evil murder of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas.
Yeah.
They dress him up as a child with a big sweater and the oversized glasses. So they will find a way to make him look as childlike as possible. But the fact that his age would come up in the penalty phase, where if he's found guilty, that will say, Your Honor, he's a child, and I think that is where it plays. But as far as having as part of his defense, it's sort of built in by the fact that they're going to present him as this kid who had mental ailments, who was dependent on his parents for medications which he didn't get, and so he didn't have the mental capacity, the mens rea, the intent to commit the most heinous of the crimes.
Well, I mean, if that's the case, I would like to see some other evidence of some other time when he behaved like this. Because it just happened once? I mean, that's nuts to think that somebody can be that evil for that prolonged amount of time against someone who's in the family. The whole thing just is so gross. And I know that that's going to be like a prevailing feeling among jurors, like, ew, the ew factor, and they'll probably have to see her body. And that's another question. When it comes to an 18-year-old victim who dies after a violent and, I mean, really, I don't know what other adjective I could put on this, but just sort of a disturbing rape, right? The underwear found inside her. How graphic are the pictures that the jury has to see?
Oh, yeah, you have to have a strong stomach to be a juror in these sex crime cases. And there's just no way for those jurors to unsee it. So once that gets into evidence, it's more likely then that he'd be found guilty of the murder. And that's where there'd be some instructions to the jury as to how to extrapolate certain evidence. I mean, you're not supposed to use propensity evidence, meaning you're not supposed to say, yeah, because he did the sexual assault, then of
Hudson's
course he's a
post-crime
murderer.
conduct is where the behavioral analysis becomes critical. He was captured on surveillance footage peeking out from the cabin door. He walked across the ship to dispose of Anna's phone, smashed. He did not raise an alarm. He navigated that ship like someone running a controlled operation, not someone who had just witnessed or stumbled into something horrific. The evidentiary spine of this prosecution is formidable.
You know, you have to prove the elements of each charge. But it's so hard for jurors to unsee it. And that's why once they see that the sexual assault happened, they're going to hate this guy. They're going to hate this kid. And you're not going to be able to really separate it from the murder because it's part of the murder. It's part of his motive. He was allegedly having sex with her, choking her in involuntary sex rape. And that's how she died, because he kept her in a chokehold the whole time. So it's hard to separate one from the other.
So usually when a sentence comes down, most people think, well, that's terrible, but no one ever serves their whole sentence. But this is federal. And I'm wondering, you got a juvie in federal. Is he going to get an opportunity to get out early if he's convicted of this crime?
Well, he'll be treated in adult court like an adult criminal. And if he gets convicted, then he can get good conduct time, which can usually eliminate about 15% of the sentence if he's given a number of years. That wouldn't affect a life sentence. But there is no parole board at the federal level. There is no parole at the state level, although if he was prosecuted in this way as a juvenile in the state system, the state court system, he would be eligible for a review. Federal system is tougher on that, and that's another disadvantage for him for being in the federal system. They don't have the same type of review later in life that a state conviction would provide for a juvenile who is tried as an adult. So although you cannot get the death penalty in either the state or the federal system, if you're a juvenile, you could, in certain circumstances, get life in prison. The judge has to jump through a bunch of extra hoops for it because he's a juvenile, but it is possible he'll spend the rest of his life in prison.
Surveillance footage places Hudson alone with Anna for approximately 2 hours before her death. The medical examiner's findings include internal placement of her underwear and semen matching Hudson's DNA profile, collected from her body while she was still alive. Prosecutors are not presenting this as ambiguous. They are presenting it as a sequence: assault, death, concealment, evidence destruction. The defense, working under constrained federal discovery rules, faces an uphill challenge. Their most viable angle is intent, arguing the absence of long-term premeditation. But federal law does not require weeks of planning. Premeditation can form in seconds, and the phone disposal alone, that deliberate walk across a cruise ship to discard a smashed device, is the kind of consciousness of guilt evidence that juries remember. On June 15th, Timothy Hudson was transferred into U.S. Marshals pretrial custody after being declared an adult by the court, a rare move in federal juvenile cases and a significant one. Federal maritime jurisdiction removes this case entirely from state juvenile systems. If convicted of first-degree murder and aggravated sexual abuse, Hudson faces life without parole. There is no federal parole, no juvenile track. Legal analyst Dave Arenberg, speaking on Drop Dead Serious, described the evidentiary weight as overwhelming and the procedural landscape as deeply disadvantageous for the defense. In both the United States and Australia, the transfer of juveniles into adult federal court for crimes of this nature remains statistically rare, which is precisely why makes this case a benchmark worth watching. What lingers here is not the horror of the crime itself, it is the silence that followed it. A 16-year-old moved through a ship full of people, disposed of evidence, and continued to function. Whether that's the behavior of someone calculating survival or something more deliberate is ultimately what a jury will decide, but I want to know what you think. Drop your analysis in the comments and ask yourself this: if the evidence is as documented as prosecutors claim, what does it mean that it still took months to charge him?